in the second day of the second session of Professor Patnaik, and indeed he was talking about neoliberalism last day, and in continuation of his last lecture, he will be speaking today on the crisis of neoliberalism. And I hope that he will be picking up from what he left yesterday, because some equations are not done yesterday, so we will be very gladly going to start with that, and I hope that there is no need of talking much, because those who followed yesterday him, I think they will be doing. And I would like to call another teacher, she is here, so can I call her to moderate the session? You can come and moderate. So I thought that you are not here. So sorry. Thank you.
Most respected Professor Prabhat Patnaik, other distinguished participants, a very warm good afternoon to all. So, as you all know, the topic of the presentation is the crisis of neoliberal capitalism. Actually, I am not an expert in this field, but however, one thing I noticed is that the current neglect of international climate finance is the outcome of maybe the failure or the crisis of, maybe we can call it as the crisis of neoliberal framework. Because when the international agreement started with the international climate finance, and we are incorporated the 17th Sustainable Development Partnership, actually the most the deleted item in the international perspectives or public policies is the aspects related to this international climate finance. And based on the moral responsibility, it is the duty of the global north to protect the global south based on the historical injustice, and the injustice continuing now. It is the duty of the global north to support or mitigate the climate issues, and adequate funds should be given for the climate adaptation policies or measures. So in that context, there is a famous paper which is published in 2005, which is noted that, I think it is published by Magnan in 2005, which is noted that the failure of the neoliberal agenda or the framework is the thinking or the lack of alternative policies in terms of public or the international framework. So in that sense, it is matched with the crisis. And now the professor already started the crisis issues and in the larger framework. And it is a great privilege to invite Professor Prabhat Patnaik to speak on the topic. And I think it is a great opportunity for the research scholars and students to interact with the Professor Patnaik and eminent professor in this field. Once again, I thank all of you and invite Professor for the presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I shall, today since there is a blackboard, I shall begin by slightly surveying, revising the kind of thing I was talking about yesterday. The point was that, I had two identities in mind. One, of course, is the national income identity, which says that Y is equal to C plus I plus G plus X minus M. And the other is an identity that actually says that X minus M, that is the current account surplus on the balance of payments, is equal to the net increase in claims on foreigners. Okay. Now, these are standard identities. Then I said that suppose, after all, a neoliberal economy is one where capital, including finance, is free to move across country borders. Goods and services are free to move across country borders. Therefore, in a sense, the state, of course, has very little control because you cannot impose controls on capital flows without delinking yourself from the neoliberal regime, and you cannot impose heavy protection for your goods. You're allowed a certain amount of protection unless, again, you delink from the neoliberal regime. I know that the United States is now protecting itself on imports from China, but on the other hand, that is something which the United States can get away with. It's not something that any other country can easily get away with. And they always argue that protection against China is because the Chinese are literally dumping their goods in the US market, that they're resorting to unfair trade. Okay, now suppose we do this. Now, if it is the case, I mean, I just want to argue a general proposition. Suppose it is the case that there is a capital flow out of the country, capital outflow. Now, a capital outflow from the country is analogous to a net increase in our claims on foreigners. This is a very odd thing, but that's the kind of peculiarity of the capital account. If you have a capital outflow, that basically means that the foreigners are reducing their debt as far as we are concerned, all right? That's the same as saying that our claims upon them is actually, you know, I mean, if we have some claims upon them, they have some claims upon us. If they're taking their capital, then of course their claims upon us are reducing. That means our claims upon them are increasing. Okay, that's so. A capital outflow, therefore, would mean that there is a net increase in claims on foreigners, which means your X minus M has to increase. In common sense terms, your X minus M has to increase in order to earn enough foreign exchange to allow the foreigners to take it out of the country. Okay? Now, how does X minus M increase? At any given exchange rate, X, let us say, is given by whatever the competitiveness of the economy and the size of the world economy, the size of demand in the world economy, and so on. So X is given. Therefore, X minus M can increase only if M decreases. All right? By the way, I'd like to let you think along with me. Okay, in other words, just think along with me. So, X minus M has to rise because there's an outflow. X is something which is more or less given at any given exchange rate. I'll come to exchange rate depreciation in a moment. Therefore, M must fall. And typically, at any given exchange rate, M is some kind of a import propensity multiplied by the level of income. So it follows, therefore, that a fall in the imports, since the import propensity is more or less given at any given exchange rate, would entail a fall in the level of income. So if the foreigners take their money out of the country, that basically means that there is a deflation of the economy to allow this to happen. Okay? Now, some people then say, but why deflate? Why not devalue the currency? So let's see what devaluation does. What the devaluation does is that in any economy, I'm assuming for simplicity, this makes no difference to the argument. One can make it more complex, one can argue in terms of input-output tables and so on, but this is fundamentally, I'm assuming, a one good economy produces one good. Let A be the amount of imported input. It produces one good with the help of imported input and labor. Okay? So if A is the amount of imported input per unit of output, this A has a certain value in the international market in terms of dollars, let's call it P bar, multiplied by the price of the dollar, that is, let us say PF, that is the price of foreign exchange in terms of our domestic currency. This plus the wage rate in terms of the domestic currency multiplied by the labor coefficient per unit of output is the total prime cost per unit of output. Okay? This multiplied by a markup is actually what gives us the price. The price, we are assuming a very simple model in which the price is just a markup over the unit prime cost. Is this clear? Okay. Now, let's just divide all through by P, in which case we have 1 is equal to okay, all right. Now, therefore, suppose we actually have a nominal depreciation of the currency. That means PF goes up. PF, remember, is the nominal price of foreign exchange, the price of dollars in terms of rupees. All right? So if PF goes up, a rise in PF in itself would not make any difference to our import or competitiveness or export or trade competitiveness if it is the case that with PF going up, P goes up exactly in the same proportion. Because what that would mean is that in dollars, suppose it is the case that the 10% decrease in the value of the rupee in terms of dollar. That means, but at the same time is accompanied by a 10% increase in the prices of all goods in terms of rupees, then the prices of goods in terms of dollars remains unchanged. Okay. So, in any such situation, if exchange rate depreciation is to make any difference to the country, then this whole thing must go up. It's not enough that PF alone goes up. This whole thing must go up. This is called the real effective exchange rate. Okay? So it's not enough that the nominal exchange rate should be depreciated, but the real effective exchange rate should be depreciated, which means the price of foreign exchange in real terms, that is deflated by the price level of the country, must go up. Is this clear? Okay? It is that alone which can make a difference to the competitive strength of the economy. Now, if for this to go up, however, P bar is given, this is the price in the world market of our imported input. It could be oil. Now, oil price is not really affected by whether we are depreciating our currency. A is given by technological conditions. Therefore, this going up implies if the profit margin remains unchanged, then there must be a fall in the real wages. Now, the point, this is what I was trying to say. This is an aspect of an exchange rate depreciation which is hardly ever mentioned. Okay. Now, but it's very important. You see, yesterday, for instance, I think someone asked me that the rupee is overvalued. Now, what exactly does it mean? If one believes that the rupee is overvalued, let's assume it is, then that would mean that the rupee should be depreciated. But the depreciation of the rupee is something which would immediately give rise to inflation, that will give rise to a squeeze on real wages or the real incomes of the working people whose money incomes are inflexible relatively. Okay? So basically, if you say that the rupee is overvalued, that would amount to saying that we should actually embark on a course of action that gives rise to a squeeze on the working people of the country. Okay. In fact, I have a friend who used to be a very well-known neoliberal economist, Montek Singh Ahluwalia. He once talked to me. He said, don't you think the rupee is overvalued? I said, no. He said, but then you must believe it's undervalued because it must be one or the other. But the point is that is trapping you within a neoliberal discourse. That is trapping you within a discourse in which you believe that there is one single exchange rate at which you can have an equilibrium in the foreign exchange market, and whether the current exchange rate happens to be that or is above or below it. Okay. But I don't believe there is one such exchange rate. I mean, there are two problems with this entire way of looking. One is that I don't believe there is any such single exchange rate at which the foreign exchange market is going to clear in that sense. because it depends, as we just saw, on whether people take out money, whether they bring in money, and so on and so forth. So it depends on the behavior of international speculators. You may think you have reached an equilibrium exchange rate, but tomorrow, if somebody thinks that no, this exchange rate is not going to last, they're going to take out money, and that is a situation that would actually give rise to a depreciation of the exchange rate, inflation, and all the rest of it. So firstly, in a speculative market, there is no such thing as an equilibrium exchange rate at which the market is going to clear. But secondly, the fact that this has distributional implications, the fact that no matter, what the exchange rate is something that makes a difference to the distribution, because then it makes a difference to the real wages and so on, is something which is not generally recognized. Yes, please.
But that's still, considering a very static point of view, because history is replete with instances where, countries like South Korea, they have their currencies depreciating, the East Asian tigers, and then they kind of move up the value chain, and finally their incomes rises. So at a static point of time.
No, I'm perfect. You see, the fallacy in the logic of the kind of argument you're presenting, namely that I'm perfectly willing to believe, absolutely perfectly willing to believe there may be many countries who can actually benefit from participating in the neoliberal arrangement. But my point is to argue from the instance of those countries participating and benefiting that everybody who participates is going to benefit is the error. Okay? And I'm particularly trying to talk about a large country with a large number of unemployed workers, with a large unorganized sector. Now, such a country, and with trade unions which are not powerful enough to maintain their real wages, if they were, then of course you would have hyperinflation, then you would not even have stability in the foreign exchange market. Do you see what I mean? So I want you to think with me. Yes. The weakness of trade unions is important for the working of the neoliberal framework. The weakness, not the strength of the trade unions.
They can bring this real wage rate somehow.
If they do, in that case, there is no real effective exchange rate depreciation. And if, therefore, the nominal exchange rate keeps depreciating, you would have continuous wage price spiral, continuous inflation, no stability either in the foreign exchange market or in the goods market or in the labor market. Okay. Yes. As a matter of fact, this is an interesting point. I'm sorry, I'm just moving away from that. One of the things that Keynes argued in the general theory is that the capitalist economy works because of the fact that there are price takers. If everybody was able to maintain their real income, or their share of income, in that case, the slightest change in any variable would make the prices zoom up to infinity or to zero. Because then everybody would be enforcing their real claims on output. Okay, so Keynes has a brilliant sentence which actually says that the stability of money wages rather than of real wages is a condition for the stability of the system. And on the contrary, you find that the critique of Keynes that everybody says is because, oh, look, he assumed fixed money wages, that's why he got the results. Actually, he's making a far deeper point. He's actually making the point that a capitalist system cannot work unless you have a set of people whose money wages are stable. Okay. Now, why it is stable is a separate matter. Keynes assumed that there's a money illusion that they have. Marx assumed that there is a reserve army of labor, and those are different issues. But fundamentally, this is a logical point that in any capitalist economy, if you do not have the fixity or relative fixity of money wages, in that case you would have relative stickiness of money wages, then the system would just explode. Okay. So, therefore, so obviously the level of the standard of living of the working population is something that basically becomes dependent on the whims and caprices of a bunch of speculators. The speculators take money out, and therefore we have a kind of, a person in Kottayam or a person in Kasaragod experiencing a decline in the standard of living, because the rupee depreciates. Let's say our oil import prices go up, therefore oil import prices get passed on, all prices go up, and therefore the real living standards of an average worker residing in a remote village in Kerala is determined in such an economy by the speculative behavior of a bunch of people who move funds around from one country to another. And now, any questions on this? Now, what happens? You see, what happens when the opposite happens? When you have money coming into the economy. When money comes into the economy, then of course the opposite happens, namely that you, in principle, with money coming in, there has to be, of course, a fall in X minus M. I argued yesterday that the fall in X minus M is something which you could think of the opposite happening, namely that in such a case, instead of a depreciation of the exchange rate, you see all the expenditure items, domestically controlled expenditure, controllable expenditure items, none of them is going to increase. Okay, so there is no reason why. I mean, if consumption is a function of income, investment is a function of the state of expectations, let's call it S. Government expenditure is in fact some tax plus the deficit ordained by the fiscal responsibility legislation. In that case, there is nothing that, if money is coming in, there is nothing that necessarily entails an automatic increase in expenditure. Okay? That being the case, two things are possible. One is that X minus M must fall, and X minus M would fall if you have, if there is no rise in imports, X minus M would have to fall through a rise in the import propensity per unit of output, and that would happen through an appreciation of the exchange rate that makes imports cheaper, which means if we use more imported inputs instead of domestically produced inputs, or more imported goods instead of domestically produced goods, and that creates deindustrialization domestically. So I said that is a case of debt-financed deindustrialization. But the governments are smarter. Our government has generally been smarter, and therefore you don't allow this to happen. What you do is that you simply hold whatever money is coming in the form of reserves. The Reserve Bank holds the money in the form of reserves, does not allow the exchange rate to appreciate. Okay. If you allowed the exchange rate to appreciate, then your imports become cheaper and so on, and then you're in trouble. So you don't allow the exchange rate to appreciate, you hold the money in the form of reserves. Stabilize the exchange rate. Now, if you hold the money in the form of reserves, in that case, in effect, the net increase in claims on foreigners is zero, because even though $100 have come in, and therefore foreigners' claims on our economy have increased by $100, the Reserve Bank of India is holding these $100, which basically means our claims on foreigners have increased by an exactly identical amount. Am I making myself clear? So we don't allow any changes in X minus M, and we hold the exchange rate where it is by making sure that net increase in claims on the foreigners does not change. Now, so you can see there's an asymmetry that when money flows out, of course, when money flows out, we could run down the reserves, in which case there would be no effect on the economy. But if we have enough reserves to run down when money flows out, fine. But if large amounts of money flow out, in that case we may not have enough reserves and we may not wish to use up the reserves to stabilize the exchange rate, in which case we would actually have to go through what I mentioned, a deflation, come devaluation, and the devaluation necessarily would raise inflation at the expense of the working people. But on the other hand, when money comes in, we have a certain kind of leeway. I mean, in other words, nobody can prevent you. You see, when money is flowing out, you may not have enough reserves to stabilize the exchange rate. But when money is flowing in, you're in a happy position. You can stabilize the exchange rate by simply holding on to the money flowing in as reserves, which is what the Reserve Bank is doing, which is the major difference between our case and China's case. China also has huge foreign exchange reserves, but those foreign exchange reserves have been built up in China from their own export surpluses, while our foreign exchange reserves have been built up almost entirely from the inflow of finance. Okay, so now the foreign exchange reserves coming in is something which, of course, gives rise to an increase the foreign exchange coming in gives rise to an increase in RBI's foreign exchange reserves. That creates a kind of problem which I was mentioning yesterday, that effectively the country is borrowing dear to lend cheap, because the interest rate that you earn on the exchange reserve holding of the Reserve Bank of India is really 1 to 1.5%, no more than that. But on the other hand, those who have brought in the money to the economy are earning much higher interest rates. So effectively, the country is borrowing dear to lend cheap. And that is something which is quite unwise, because effectively it is not in the long run it will create problems. All right, but let us leave that aside. If the Reserve Bank actually is holding reserves, can there be indirectly an increase in the level of income domestically? You see, it is possible. Okay, the Reserve Bank holding reserves means it makes money available, rupees available to whoever is bringing in dollars. Those fellows then, suppose they buy shares or whatever, then ultimately, let's assume that these rupees find their way to the banking system. In which case, the increase in the reserve money is $100 worth of rupees, and then you can say banks having these reserves allows them to lend more, and therefore credit becomes easier to obtain. And if that happens, then people's expenditure may go up because credit has become easier to obtain. Am I making myself clear? Okay. This is the only mechanism you can think of in terms of which there may be a rise in expenditures, and it is possible to argue that rise in expenditures may give rise to an increase in income. Not all rise in expenditures would give rise to an increase in income. In fact, much of it would not. Suppose, let me just give you an example. Suppose it is the case that the banks are giving out money, and I borrow money from the banks in order to have a trip in Italy, in order to go for a vacation in Italy, in which case I borrow money from the banks, then I go and change it into foreign exchange, and then I go to Italy. In which case, it is true that my consumption has gone up because I am undertaking a trip to Italy that I otherwise would not have. My consumption has gone up because of the ease of credit. The state of credit has eased, but at the same time, imports have gone up because of the fact that I'm getting this money and spending it in Italy. So effectively, I'm importing services from Italy. Okay. In which case, there is no impact on the domestic economy. If this is $100 and this is $100, in that case, Y remains unchanged. Plus is 100, minus is 100. So y remains unchanged. This, by the way, has been happening in the Indian economy, as you know, because I keep reading in newspapers that apparently a lot of well-to-do Indians now are having vacations abroad. That was not the case earlier. And I think that's obviously because of the fact, I don't know if they borrow from banks, but certainly because of the fact that foreign exchange is now more easily available. I must tell you, when I first went to England to start, as a postgraduate student, so tight was the exchange control that after going to the Reserve Bank of India office in Delhi, literally every day for a period of 2 months, ultimately my passport was stamped with something called a P form. That P form entitled me to take £3 as the foreign exchange I could carry abroad. I was 21 years old. I was going for the first time to a foreign country. I'd never been abroad. To go to a foreign country you know nothing about, and with £3, which is not even, which 80% of which goes in the bus fare from the airport to the town you have to go to, is something which is quite amazing. But it shows the rigidity of import controls, rigidity of foreign exchange control regimes those days. But
you will return to the RBI, how much penny are spent for what are the particulars. Even the exporters suffered a lot.
Yeah. Anyway, that I didn't have to do. Anyway, so the thing is that therefore, so it follows that even if through this indirect route, what is the indirect route? The Reserve Bank's assets go up, foreign exchange assets, in lieu of which its liabilities go up. The Reserve Bank's liabilities is what we call reserve money. So the level of reserve money in the economy goes up, and when the level of reserve money in the economy goes up, then banks' reserves go up, and therefore, when banks' reserves go up, they are in a position to enlarge credit, and therefore people's spending may actually go up. Now, this is something which is the indirect route through which capital inflows can generate a larger amount of expenditure. But the important thing is, this larger amount of expenditures, is it going to be, what kind of expenditures would they generate? Larger expenditures do not necessarily mean larger income. I just give you an example. Okay, if the larger expenditures take the form are 100% foreign exchange intensive, in that case they do not create any multiplier effects domestically. They would create multiplier effects domestically, they would give rise to some increase in demand for domestic goods if it is the case that not all the 100% is spent on foreign goods. Now, this of course would be the case if you had, if this credit was given to peasants, let us say, is given to farmers, if this credit was given to small businessmen and so on, then they would be spending locally. I'll tell you another story. Can I just sit down? Yeah. You see, I used to work in Kerala some years ago along with Hari, and at that point we used to go around finding out MGNREGS sites, how exactly people who got these wages from MGNREGS spent it. And the answers we used to get those days were things like, well, we spent it in buying those stone, the stuff from which dosa paste is made, those stone kind of, grinders. Now, the stone grinders, you don't import from abroad. The stone grinders are locally manufactured. It follows, therefore, that the kind of multiplier effects which can be generated if expenditure is carried out by a whole bunch of small buyers, which would consist of petty producers, farmers, small traders and small manufacturers and so on, would have a much higher multiplier effect. Its foreign exchange component would be very, very small. But on the other hand, if you allow, I mean, if it is the case that we are talking about expenditure, if credit is given to the relatively affluent people, in that case, obviously, the foreign exchange component of that is going to be much higher, in which case its impact on the domestic economy is much lower. There have been innumerable occasions, let us say on a Sunday afternoon when you're resting, when I would get a call from somebody or the other saying that, you know, would you like a credit card? I'd say, no, I don't, I already have, I don't want any more. Then after some time, because my wife's name has the same initials in the surname, so I will get another call for her. Would you like a credit card? Now the point is that time, financial institutions are running after middle class customers to give them credit. But on the other hand, at the very same time, farmers, peasants were being discriminated against in credit distribution. In fact, a lot of nationalized banks, certainly private banks, ICICI actually said that we can't be bothered about giving loans to farmers, it's too complicated, we will give it to what they call facilitators, that means intermediaries between the farmers and the banks themselves. And these intermediaries were people who would take money from the banks and give it to the farmers at much higher interest rates. It's actually promoting a kind of, you know, usury of the earlier days. So at the time, and many nationalized banks pretended they were giving loans. Again, when I was in Kerala, we would, you know, sometimes I used to travel, and I went to a bank in Kasaragod or somewhere, and they told me very frankly, sir, in the last 18 months, we have not given a single agricultural loan. So I said, but then how do you meet the priority sector norms? They said, you know, if you give loan for a scooter, in a village, that is included in priority sector. So effectively what you find is that credit does not go to those who by and large have a much higher propensity to consume and much higher propensity to consume domestically manufactured goods. Therefore, the idea that a relaxation in credit because of the inflow of finance from outside would actually give rise to a substantial increase in expenditure on domestically produced goods and therefore a substantial increase in output is not an idea which I find very convincing. Typically, of course, there may be some expenditures, but these expenditures would be typically on commodities with very high foreign exchange content, and therefore they would not generate much increase in incomes. And what is more, many of the banks would actually be holding on to excess reserves rather than giving credit. I mean, certainly they would much prefer to hold on to excess reserves than to give credit to farmers. That most banks would do. But on the other hand, even in the United, I mean, particularly the US experience is very striking in this regard, that in order to stimulate the US economy, they had this whole idea of actually pumping money into the economy. You know, the central banks, they reduced the interest rates virtually to zero, and then they started pumping money into the economy, but the banks held on to excess reserves rather than giving out very many loans, because, you know, the poor people don't even demand very many loans, even if loans may be available, because they are not very sure about being able to pay back the loans, in which case they may have to commit suicide, as many peasants did. So in the US, in any case, the history of being indebted actually makes you less inclined to be further indebted at the margin. So the point is, and the same is true here as well. So in general, if your exchange reserves are growing because of the inflow of finance. This inflow of finance, its impact on domestic output is very limited. So I'm suggesting an asymmetry, that when finance flows out, then you find that income has to be curtailed. When finance flows in, then there is no corresponding mechanism for actually increasing the level of income. On the contrary, what you find is at the most the level of income would remain unchanged or increase marginally, but not very substantially. So that is the first thing. Therefore, what this entire arrangement does is that people's living standards then become dependent on the whims of capital, whims of particularly of finance. Now let's assume a good scenario like India has had, a good scenario in which there has been no run on the country. Okay, I mean, we know that our countries in our neighborhood are really finding very tight foreign exchange situations, but let's assume that we are talking about a good scenario. But then there's a second problem that arises. The second problem is that trade openness implies that you can have, I mean, if imports increase, that is something which is very obvious, that suppose it is the case that the country suddenly increases imports by $100, then you find that there would be a decline in output because the increase in imports by $100 would make some domestic producers unable to sell their products, those who are outcompeted, and that being the case, you would find that your income would actually go down, which is exactly standard Keynesian mechanism. And import surplus gives rise to a reduction in the level of aggregate demand and therefore a reduction in the level of output. Now, these days, I find that even Diwali diyas are now manufactured in China. Something which was in the local village you found these diyas, but now they're all imported from China. Now, one of the problems about trade openness is that there is domestic unemployment that is generated because of the preference for imported goods. Now, it may be that the imported goods have better quality, and this, by the way, takes one back to a very long and very interesting and intense debate which had taken place in India between Gandhi and Tagore. You see, when Gandhi's idea was that, look, how can I wear an imported piece of clothing from Savile Row? Savile Row is a well-known place in London where you have very stylistic suits and so on made. How can I wear a village is being unemployed because of that? The fact that employment is a factor in my decision to whether buy domestic or imported goods is something which is not taken care of at all. By the way, this is one of the problems with the entire Ricardian theory of comparative advantage, and all free traders who argue about free trade, they say that, look, if you have free trade, in that case, as I was saying yesterday, Ricardo assumed full employment, so that, it made no difference. Those who are unemployed would go and produce something else, and in which we have comparative advantage, and they would in turn be exporting. But there is nothing else to produce. There is nothing else that you can export. Now, against this, Tagore's argument was that, look, the persons who are buying imported cloth rather than domestically produced cloth are doing so because the imported cloth is cheaper, because the imported cloth is of better quality. Therefore, their standard of living is going up by substituting domestically produced goods by foreign goods. Now, if that is the case, then how can you... And he said that, look, the peasant's standard of living is going up because of the imported cloth, then how can you object to it? And he actually, there was this debate in the form of letters that were exchanged between them, and Tagore actually wrote a novel called Ghore Baire. I don't know, you must have seen Satyajit Ray made a film of this Ghore Baire, in which this is the crux of the issue, because there was a Swadeshi movement in Bengal against imported goods, and Tagore was very critical of it because imported goods improved the standard of living of the peasants. Okay. There was another interesting sidelight to it, because in the United Bengal, a lot of the majority of the peasants were actually Muslims, while the people who are leading the Swadeshi movements were intellectuals, majority of whom were Hindus. So Tagore actually said that if you go on with this kind of agitation, it's going to worsen the communal conflict in Bengal. So the fascinating debate that occurred in the pre-independence period on the basis of this. One of the things that both Gandhi and Tagore missed is the following, that the peasants who apparently have a better living standard because they consume imported cloth, you actually find that as unemployment increases, because the domestic producers of the goods which are being substituted by imports become unemployed, the pressure on land increases, because of which the rents increase. And likewise, in the labor market, the pressure of supply increases, because of which the real wages decline. As a result, those who appeared to benefit from consuming imported cloth find over a period of time their real incomes are also going down, because after all, if you have a huge labor reserves, then this also impinges on the living standards of those who are employed. Therefore, the matter cannot just be decided only on the basis of what is happening immediately. You have to look at it, the consequences over a period of time. But the point is that it is an extremely important issue, that whenever we talk about the benefits of free trade, a question we have to ask anybody is that, what about employment? What effect is this going to have on unemployment? So the first point I tried to make is that the level of output becomes a matter depending, it becomes dependent on the whims and caprices of a bunch of finance capitalists who are really speculatively moving their funds around the world. The second point I want to make is that the level of income of the country also becomes dependent on the fact that, you can have imports from other countries that actually substitute your domestic producers. And there is nothing to ensure that these domestic producers are going to get absorbed, like people like Ricardo or Heckscher and Olin took for granted by assuming it. They assume full employment, but in fact there is absolutely no reason why these labor reserves, which are so created, would actually get fully employed. Now, that leads one to a question, namely that I was saying that suppose for a moment we assume that there are no capital outflows, we have enough reserves, we don't worry about it, so the exchange rate is given. And suppose we also assume that trade is one which, all the competition that could take place and the unemployment that got generated because of it is over. That from now on, we are producing a whole range of goods where no Chinese or Malaysians or whatever, or Americans or anybody can possibly outcompete us. Okay? Suppose that is the case. In which case, our import propensities are more or less have reached a plateau. They have stabilized. In such a world, of course, the rate of growth of output would be dependent on the rate of growth of exports. Okay? And that is the logic of the export-led growth argument, that fundamentally it is the rate of growth of exports that determines the rate of growth of output. But the point is that because we assume that the rate of growth of exports therefore is crucial, how do we grow, how do we increase our exports? Our exports, or any country's exports, would then depend upon two very obvious factors, mathematical truism: the rate of growth of the world market and the share that a country can have of the world market. Okay. Now you can try and increase that share. The rate of growth of the world market we can do very little about, but we can increase our share of this world market by various means. And the means which are normally taken to be what a country should be doing in such a world is to invite foreign capital in order to locate plants domestically, so that, what's the problem?
Battery is down, so the sound is getting distracted.
So what should I do?
No, you need not to do anything. We'll do it. I'll change the battery.
I see. So in such a case, we invite foreign capital in order to locate plants domestically, plants which they would have otherwise located in the United States or in Germany or somewhere. We invite them to locate. And it is argued, in fact, the entire rationale behind neoliberal policies is that now capital has become footloose. Capital is no longer interested in remaining in the advanced countries themselves. It's now willing to locate plants where you have low wages and then export produce for the world market. China, Vietnam and so on have been beneficiaries of this. India has been a beneficiary, particularly of service sector activities being located here. But this relocation of activities because of low wages is something which therefore should make us, attract foreign capital as much as possible. Now, the problem with this, of course, is that when foreign capital is attracted, or when you set up a regime that is attractive to foreign capital, it's not very clear that you are actually attracting only foreign capital that is interested in exporting from your country. That actually the foreign capital that comes in may be used, may be interested not just in exporting to the world economy, but it may be interested in actually ousting your own domestic producers, in fact taking over your domestic market. And therefore it follows that there is no way, just as there is no way of discriminating between financial capital and capital in production when you set up a regime under neoliberalism, likewise, there is no way of discriminating between capital in production that is going to sell only internationally and capital in production that is going to sell also in the domestic market. As a matter of fact, for a very long period of time, many countries had this policy of, export processing zones and so on, where you effectively allowed capital to come in, locate itself and export. And they were given all kinds of concessions, but within that particular zone. But on the other hand, they were not allowed to sell in the domestic market. But obviously that is something which went along with neoliberalism. Firstly, of course, even before neoliberal policies were adopted, the proportion of their output which they were allowed to sell in the domestic market kept rising and rising and rising. And ultimately, of course, you had the entire country, in a sense, mimicking what the export processing zones did. So that is the second thing. So it follows then. So I have been arguing that a country getting caught in the context of a neoliberal regime entails a number of issues as far as the working people are concerned, the peasants, the workers, the petty producers and so on. Number one, I argued yesterday that since capital is globalized and the state is a nation state, the policies of the nation state have to conform to the wishes of international finance capital, which basically means that the state cannot do whatever it could do earlier. Including in the fiscal realm, the state cannot have, cannot spend as it likes because it has a certain proportion of GDP, which is a ceiling on, on the fiscal deficit it can run. The second point is that the level of activity in the economy, not just what the state can or cannot do, but the level of activity in the economy becomes essentially dependent upon the whims of globalized finance. The third is that the level of activity in the economy becomes dependent not just on the whims of globalized finance, but also on the whole question of how much you can compete against other countries, to what extent the other countries can take away your market. It becomes a competitive struggle. Now, I think there are two aspects to it. One is whether you are going to come out of this competitive struggle without much employment loss. But the second, which what I want you to think about, is that it's an utterly immoral world in which each country is actually involved in ensuring that it does not become the victim of unemployment, but some other country becomes the victim of unemployment. So this kind of a competitive struggle between countries to do down one another, which is a feature of capitalism. It's, a feature of capitalism. The firms used to do it in standard model of capitalism. But now, with globalization, it's not just the firms, countries are more or less forced to do it. This is something which, I would like you to think about the moral aspects of it. The fourth point, or the third point, is that in order to attract capital, you have to, in this competitive struggle, by the way, capitalism involves a Darwinian struggle, that it's a competition where the devil takes the hindmost, which is why it's a Darwinian struggle, a struggle in which you really, some people have to die, and that's why everybody wants to make sure that you are not the one who's dying, okay? Now, in that, in order to make yourself attractive to international capital so that they come to your country to locate production instead of going to Vietnam or to Indonesia and so on, you have to make sure that the conditions of the workers and so on is as bad as possible. In fact, denying the rights to workers, denying similarly the rights to peasants and so on, becomes an attractive ploy for obtaining international business to come to your country. Now that again is fundamentally anti-people, anti-democratic and anti-working people. So the entire thrust of the neoliberal regime is one which denies democracy because, as I said, choice disappears as long as you remain kind of stuck within it. Secondly, it is one in which there is the living conditions of people are something over which nobody can control. It really depends on the whims of the speculators. It depends upon whether some other country is stealing your markets and so on. And thirdly, in order to survive, what you do is to actually squeeze the working people, their living standards. And even if you do so, there is no guarantee that you survive. You can actually make the standards of the workers as bad as possible, but on the other hand, there is no guarantee that you'll survive. My wife, Utsa, who was lecturing in the morning, she was on a tribunal which heard evidence from the garment workers, women garment workers, and you know, garment workers, the garment industry in Bangladesh has really flourished in this sense, where, you know, it has grown under the neoliberal regime. And you talk to any economist, they would say, what a wonderful thing. It's a success story of neoliberalism. But the conditions of those women, their working conditions are so abysmal, you know. So she had evidence from it, just utterly shocking. Anyway, so the thing is that, you know, that you actually drive down the living conditions of the workers in order to be a success story. And you may not be a success story. And in fact, Bangladesh, which was a success story, is now facing great difficulties. So the point I'm trying to make about the neoliberal regime is that it takes decision making out of the hands of the people. Economics determines politics, because you cannot politically control the economy. Rather, the arrangements of the economy are more or less accepted by all political formations. And secondly, it actually subverts the entire notion of freedom, the entire notion of full employment and so on, which Keynes was so kind of keen on, which anybody who believes in a humane society would be keen on, and you know, including many capitalists or many supporters of capitalism who actually thought that the system can bring about a humane society, would find that they are not in a position to witness that. In addition, this is where I get on to what I was planning to talk today. In addition, what you have is, of course, a situation that this increasingly leads to a crisis. In fact, you mentioned climate crisis. I'm really having in mind much more narrowly the economic crisis. Now, during, you know, is a part of this Darwinian struggle is that suddenly there is an increase in the rate of growth of labor productivity. There is technological change. There is substitution of, as I said, petty production for by large-scale production. There's a substitution of the neighborhood shop by Amazon. There's a substitution of kind of, you know, malls or you know, and so on, for all the kind of, you know, tiny shopkeepers that we used to have around the corner. So that kind of substitution is invariably labor saving, okay? Which is why there was all that opposition to the malls in the old days. Similarly, you find that, you know, that in manufacturing, similarly you find that in any other sphere, the entire technological progress and the pace of technological progress increases dramatically because of this Darwinian competition in which producers and countries get involved. There is an increase in the rate of growth of productivity, labor productivity. Now, if you have an increase in the rate of growth of labor productivity, then the rate of growth of employment, that is E dot by E, is equal to Y dot by Y minus beta dot by beta. Beta dot by beta is the rate of growth of labor productivity. By beta, I mean labor productivity at a macro level. The rate of growth of employment is nothing else but the rate of growth of output minus the rate of growth of labor productivity. This follows from the fact that E times beta is equal to Y. Okay. So, now, even if, I know that I mentioned it that, you know, there may be problems that even if, you know, that this is not generally, I mean, people are contesting this, but let's assume there has been a substantial increase in the rate of growth of output in India and in some other countries, not all of them, but in some other countries of the third world in the neoliberal period. But the increase in this has been so much greater that actually the rate of growth of employment is less than in the pre-neoliberal period. Obviously, these are, estimates of this are fraught with difficulties, but nonetheless, some figures which one comes across is that roughly speaking, the rate of growth of employment was about 2% per annum in the pre-neoliberal period average, while in the neoliberal period, the rate of growth of employment has been 1% per annum. Now, even though the claimed output growth has doubled from, let's say, 4% in the old days to about 7-8% now, the employment growth has perhaps halved. But I know that, this I'm not kind of asserting, because I know there are huge problems about estimating employment growth and so on. But nonetheless, the point is that, most people would agree that there is a slowing down of employment growth compared to the earlier period. Whether it's halved or not, I don't know, but there is a slowing down of employment growth. And the reason is because the rate of growth of labor productivity in the economy on average has been much greater. Yes, please.
So isn't such a narrow analysis shifting the focus from employability, because
From what?
from employability, because previously you used to have employability.
But if you have unemployment, what do you mean by employability?
I mean, like previously you had cashiers at the banks. Now you have ATMs.
Yes, and what has happened to those cashiers?
I mean, like people find new kinds of work.
Do they? The whole point I'm trying to argue is that they don't. In other words, if you say the rate of growth of employment is less than before, that basically means that if the rate of growth of the workforce is the same as before, that basically means the number of people who are unemployed is greater, except for the fact that you do not have a neat division between people who are fully employed, people who are fully unemployed. Because what you have is work rationing. And work rationing basically implies large numbers of people in India are really casual workers. And that basically implies that you go and stand by a roadside. On some days, you get employment, and on other days you don't get employment. And therefore, the unemployment basically implies that the number of days when you don't get employment is greater than before. So it's not necessarily the unemployed persons, but the unemployed labor days which would increase. That means, the rationing in the labor market takes a form in which everybody remains unemployed for a longer period of time. Let's say most people remain unemployed for a longer period of time than what you would probably find in an advanced country where the number of unemployed people, relatively speaking, increases.
Is jobless growth is a product of neoliberalism?
Jobless growth would be exactly this, yeah. Yes, so employability is no good. A graduate unemployed, they're all employable, but they're not getting employment. The meaning of employability is precisely this, that, I agree that they're all employable, but they're not getting employment.
Anything in connection with the growth of service sector and this unemployment and the digital technologies?
No, I'm not for a moment denying that in some sectors there would be growth in employment. Of course there is. In malls, for instance, there would be a lot of people getting employed. But the point is that you have to look at the totality of it.
No, I'm not asking that. I'm asking whether the implementation of digital technologies in the service sector is causing unemployment.
That is, okay. You see, there are two things. Why is it that we have an increase in unemployment? I think, or why do we have a fall in the rate of growth of employment? There are a number of factors that go into it. One is that technological progress now is much more By technological progress, I mean process innovation and product innovation. Both kinds of process and product innovation, the pace of it is much greater. One of the things that people used to be critical about India, by the way, my own professor, K.N. Raj, who used to say that, and he was not critical, he used to say it is a good thing, that in India we do not have automobiles, for instance. We have the Fiat and we have the Ambassador and so on. We don't have automobiles which are kind of, continuously being product innovated. And that was considered a good thing by him, while it was considered to be a bad thing. I've heard the managing director of IMF in a seminar saying, look at India, you find the same cars on the roads. It depends on the class perspective, I imagine. But the point is that product and process innovation, if it gets accelerated during the neoliberal phase, implies a rate of growth of labor productivity that's higher than before. Okay? Because all innovations ultimately, under capitalism, are innovations that substitute, as Marx said, dead labor for living labor. Okay? Which means basically they are labor saving.
But generally, when new generation students, when they pose this question, the question is posed in such a way that whether increase in productivity as such, whether it should be accepted. Technological change, technological growth, and improvement in productivity, whether it should be a welcome thing or not. Generally, if you are in a different kind of property relations, if you are in a different kind of system, the ability to produce using less time with less effort, if that is coming, that should be welcome.
Exactly.
Yeah, but then in a neoliberal kind of setting, this is happening, and that is what is leading to more.
Absolutely. You see, if you have a labor productivity growth under socialism in a country in which you don't, is not run on the basis of profit maximization, in that case, that would give rise to the same number of people being employed. Each one is employed for a shorter period of time, but gets the same wage as he was doing earlier. In which case, it's a genuine improvement in the living standards because you're getting the same wage, but greater leisure. But on the would have is that, suppose there's a doubling of labor productivity. In that case, in an alternative socialist society, you would have the same number of people, but each one's work hours get halved, but gets the same wage. While in a capitalist society, what you would have is that half the labor force would be sacked, and because half the labor force is unemployed, the bargaining strength of those who are employed is so low that their wages don't increase even though their productivity has doubled. So that, there is no increase in wages, but you have 50% unemployment.
Can we put the same thing in a slightly different way? Like the technological improvement, productivity improvement is happening as a result of social progress.
Can I speak to Mike?
Yeah. Yes. Improvement in science and technology, improvement in productivity, that is happening because of investment of the society in general. But the benefits of that, benefits of increasing labor productivity is cornered by capital because of private property, because of the nature of the society. If it was in a different kind of society, the benefits of technological improvement, productivity improvement would have gone to the working class themselves or the peasants themselves. Then the distributional implications would have been more people-friendly, more,
No, I would like to make it a different point, namely that, the capitalists do not succeed in reaping the benefits of it to the extent that it affects the market. To the extent that actually increase in labor productivity, but there's no increase in wages. In creates a tendency towards overproduction. And that tendency towards overproduction would imply that even the capitalists would get mired in a crisis. Okay.
I'd like to give a case for your opinion. There's a remote place it's not remote, it was a remote place in another district called Kariavattom. The one man started an aluminium company, flourished. He started a food factory. He started a ready-made factory. And his next generation, they developed it like anything. They got about 30,000 people employed there. Even hundreds of Bengali, one girl herself, she was telling, she came here, employed for the last 10 years, upgraded, got trained, everything. She became a supervisor. She got married a local man, set up a house, everything. The same organization went to Tirupur, established a fantastic factory employing around 10,000 people, flourished. And seeing this, the former government of Telangana, they sent a separate aircraft to Kerala, took him there, and they have started another big factory there. So these are the benefits of liberal capitalism.
What is the benefit? I don't see. In other words,
the society has developed. No, they have.
What is the meaning of a society developing if unemployment is growing?
No,
if no, I'm talking on the macroeconomic situation. I'm sure there are many such cases that one can think of. There are many people who are individual entrepreneurs who have done quite well. But if you look at the society, if you look at the macro level, I mean, you may say that, look, there's no unemployment, fine, I mean, you may say there's no poverty, but to the extent that is not the case, in that case, it becomes necessary for us to make a judgment about society independent of what individual entrepreneurs may have succeeded in doing. You see what I mean? Yes. Okay, let me just continue in about 10 minutes or so and then wind up. Something which I was arguing day before yesterday, I mean, if you look at one of the things that globalization has done is that it has linked the real wages of workers everywhere, and what is more, it has made the existence of enormous labor reserves in the global south pull down the real wages of workers everywhere. Okay. I gave the figure that Joseph Stiglitz has estimated that the average real wage of a male American worker in 2011 was marginally lower than in 1968. Okay, now this is not that it has steadily fallen, but gone up, but it's come down. That is exactly true of most of Europe. In fact, many of you may have come across this Branko Milanovic's elephant, where he argues that, that if you compare the real income of people in the world in 1980 with their real income in the first decade of the 21st century, then you get something like an elephant, that the real income in the middle, it has gone up the most. You plot on one axis the rate of growth of real income. You plot on the other axis the level of the real income. What he did is that the level of real income of various segments of the world population in 1980 the rate of growth of real income, obviously per capita, between 1980 and 2010, I think. Okay. And he found that it took the form of an elephant. Fundamentally, what you find is that this, on his reasoning, is where the Indian and Chinese middle classes are. They are the ones who have actually benefited the most from this globalization. Okay? This is where the poor, the African laborers, third world laborers, Indian laborers, and so on would be. And this is the workers in the advanced capitalist countries. And this, of course, is the rich in the advanced capitalist countries. So Milanovich's elephant is roughly supportive of this idea that while certain segments of the middle class have actually done quite well, particularly in these rapidly growing countries like India and China that have seen significant relocation of activities from the north to the south, the point is that, as far as the bulk of the world's population is concerned, this is not the case. And what is more, as we mentioned, that real wages, even in America, are now tied to the labor reserves of the global south. That is the first thing. So the real wages in America are tied to real wages in India, real wages in India are tied to the labor reserves of Indian labor reserves, and so on. This is true of the global south in general. But in addition, what you find is that these labor reserves are not getting exhausted. In other words, this entire relocation of activities and even the high growth rates are not really giving rise to the using up of the labor reserves. If that was the case, then you could say, yeah, okay, for the time being this is true, but on the other hand, over a period of time, you'd find that the labor reserves would get used up, and you'd get that Arthur Lewis kind of turning point in which the shortages appear, or tightness appears in the labor market, then wages would start rising and so on. But that is not happening. If that is not happening because of the reasons I was mentioning, namely that, that the rate of growth of labor productivity is generally so high that notwithstanding high rise relative to the total available workforce. Okay? And when that happens, then of course real wages don't necessarily increase. And when real wages don't increase, then for the world as a whole, because the real wages are now linked between the advanced countries and the global south, for the world as a whole, the real wages don't increase. But of course, the world as a whole, labor productivity is rising, which after all is the reason why the employment is not getting, is not rising as rapidly. If that is the case, then you find that there is a shift. You see, surplus, by surplus, I define surplus as productivity minus the real wage rate divided by productivity. That is the share of surplus. Labor productivity minus the real wage rate divided by labor productivity is the share of surplus in output. If it is the case that the share is rising, effectively then there is a shift from wages to surplus that is taking place as far as the world is concerned. This is true in individual countries, this is true in the world as a whole. If this is happening in the world as a whole, in that case, and in individual countries, then the marginal propensity to consume out of surplus, out of the incomes that accrue as surplus, is certainly lower than the marginal propensity to consume out of wages or out of the incomes of the working people. Okay? Now, if so, then over a period of time, you would find that there would be a slowing down of the rate of growth of aggregate demand, ceteris paribus. Okay? That means there would be an ex-ante tendency towards overproduction, which of course may well be kept in check because, as I mentioned, the asset price booms, the dot-com bubble, the housing bubble that followed it, are asset price bubbles, which in fact give a boost to consumption. People suddenly feel richer because if you suddenly find that there is a very high value of the asset that you happen to hold, in that case you might go and buy a yacht, you might go and buy a car or whatever. So the asset price bubbles may actually give a boost to consumption, in which case this may provide an offset to the ex-ante tendency to overproduction. People used to argue that credit-financed consumption, that even though wages are not rising, credit-financed consumption may rise because after all you borrow in order to consume. But that in the United States at least, where credit-financed consumption of the working class was quite significant at a certain point of time, turns out is no longer very significant because workers themselves, when they get into substantial amounts of debt, stop borrowing any further, so they curtail their consumption. It's not as if everybody wants to run up debt to an infinite magnitude, but there's a kind of self constraint on the amount of debt that they run. So because of this, then you find that there may be offsets to the ex-ante tendency to overproduction for some time, as they were in the 90s and early part of this part of the current century. But after 2008, there has been no such bubble. In fact, the entire effort of the advanced countries, not just of the US, but even in the European Union, was to bring down the interest rate as close to zero. In fact, in the European Union, they even had negative interest rates, that if banks were allowed, if banks could give loans for setting up an enterprise to somebody, in that case the central bank subsidized the banks rather than charging them interest for this. So that you actually had effectively negative interest rates, but even that did not succeed either in generating an asset price bubble or in generating investment, as we normally learn in economics. Interest rate affects investment. So therefore, the ex-ante tendency to overproduction has, over a period of time, because after the collapse of the asset price bubbles, has got converted into an ex-post tendency to overproduction. As a matter of fact, as I had mentioned before yesterday, that the world economy's growth rate in the decade 2010 to 2020, before the COVID-19 crisis struck the world economy's growth rate was the lowest decadal growth rate since the Second World War. Obviously, there is a stagnation which has set in as far as the world economy is concerned. Now, this stagnation has very profound political, social effects and so on, and this is something which I'd like to discuss next time.
Theoretical question.
Yeah.
With the advent of artificial intelligence and all, suppose the productivity increases by 1,000 times, what will happen?
This is disastrous as far as employment is concerned. In fact, this is what the Hollywood writers were the first group to actually agitate against it. Their agitation was called off after some settlement, but on the other hand, I believe they actually highlighted a major problem, and I think that problem is going to affect not just creative activities, but I think even just ordinary production activity, where robotics to a very significant extent might actually replace individual labor. And that happening in capitalist setting would mean that these individuals would remain unemployed without getting, and since when you remain unemployed, you don't get a wage. And so it's not as if they're enjoying infinite leisure, but the point is that they wouldn't get a wage, and so
If most of the people are unemployed and have no wages, then who is going to consume?
No, that's exactly my point. So that is going to create a problem for capitalism. Capitalism is not a planned system. As Marx said, the real enemy of capitalism is capital itself. So,
Sir, in spite of the aggregate demand problem, in fact aggravating over time, which is very obvious,
yeah.
seen everywhere. But in spite of that, of course, the boom is not happening, but then the stock prices everywhere, although predictions are there, they're going to come down and down. They are maintaining high levels even now. And Indian stock market for that matter, continuing to boom. And how this disconnect is happening? Stock prices and the real performance of companies. In fact, for many enterprises now, they don't bother about their profit performance. Instead, they are bothered about the valuation in the capital market. So, and investors are concerned not about the profit performance of companies. They look at the valuation of the company and how it is going. Like Flipkart, for example, they were not making profit for decades together. They are surviving and floating around, and people are investing in Flipkart or so many other companies. So this disconnect between share prices.
Yeah. No, I think that's a very deep and profound problem. The one kind of answer, which is a standard answer one would give to it, is that this is a speculation that's going to collapse. But I think that would not be fully a correct answer. Obviously, speculation. But on the other hand, if the speculation sooner or later collapses, in that case the collapse itself is going to be very significant. But I think there are, as it were, injection of assets which, let's say privatization of public assets. Forests become private. Okay. That is something which actually, such periodic injections would in fact prevent a kind of collapse. In other words, every such injection.
Which is happening, but then it's going on.
No,
like
but
the US debt is ballooning like anything.
Yeah, but
beyond all limits and imaginations.
Okay. Suppose tomorrow there's a collapse. What happens? When there's a collapse, the government takes over the debt. And when the government takes over the debt, it basically pays by taxing people. It doesn't, that's not 100%, but on the other hand, it certainly is a kind of socialization of debt, socialization of socialization of private asset formation, which keeps it going. In other words, periodically, if people are reasonably sure that the government is going to take over, in that case, the punishment for speculation goes down.
Sir, US, for example, they were going on printing currency without any control. And until recently, we were all accepting their currency to build up our reserve, in spite of all the disadvantages you explained. And China also, Russia, all these countries were accumulating their treasury bills. Now, very recently, that tendency is disappearing.
That's right.
China is disinvesting, and China is buying gold. And even India is buying gold. Russia has already, for a long time now, they have been accumulating gold. And in the Middle East,
in any case,
countries also, Gulf countries, and even in Africa, this tendency is going on.
Yes.
Now, how long can United States of America go on printing dollar to finance all this, to keep the stock prices high? At some point, the whole thing will have to crumble, no?
Yeah, sure. Yes.
Sir, I would like to clear some doubts. One is with regard to the open economic question. So it is not only the capital that is mobile, and now labor is also mobile.
No.
No.
Labor is never mobile. On the contrary, Britain is now actually putting immigrants who come to Britain in Africa. They're not accepting. Labor is mobile inside the European Union, but labor is not mobile between the third world and the first world. Not at all. Except what is allowed. And what, but what is allowed is a limited number of migrants. But it's not mobile in the sense that you can't just go there as you like, while inside the EU it is mobile.
One more thing is with regard to the returns to capital vis-a-vis the returns to labor. And I'm looking it from perspective of a state like Kerala, because it has been conceived that the returns to capital in Kerala is lower than the returns to
What does it mean, returns to capital and returns to labor?
In the sense that industrialization is not coming, or industrialization is not happening here, because the returns are comparatively lower.
So you're simply saying that the rate of profit on capital is less in Kerala than elsewhere.
That's the perceived notion. So I'm just checking with you.
Yeah, sure.
With regard to that doubt.
Yeah.
So only if the state is initiating policies either to raise the returns or to reduce the
No, not at all.
Reduce the wages.
No, not at all. The whole idea in post-independence India is that the state itself should undertake industrialization. So let workers' cooperatives do industrialization, because after all, then the returns to capital may be less, where their wages are high and the returns to capital are low. If the workers' cooperatives themselves do industrialization, no problem. In fact, I think those are the things one has to encourage, rather than simply beating down wages and subsidizing capitalists. In any case, there is not much investment taking place at present, even in states where the return to capital, as you say, the rate of return is very high because of the stagnation of the market. So that kind of thing would simply beat wages down for no good reason.
Or initiate policies that are not detrimental good. Good for the labor. So in support of the wages.
He's suggesting a Darwinian struggle. To give some questions from students.
Yeah.
Just a clarification regarding the real wage being tied up with the labor reserves back in India. So that is the average real wage, right? In the sense that a section of the real wage or a section of employees who has got their productivity gone up, they might be having a greater real wage, and it has some kind of import in the inequality pattern as well.
I'm talking about the macroeconomy. In other words, I have not looked at real wages of this segment or that segment. Obviously there are very substantial differences in real wages between different segments of the working population. But if you take the country, if you take the economy as a whole, then you find that on average the rate of growth of labor productivity is way higher, while the rate of growth of wages is much lower. As a matter of fact, if you look at the international economy, then the rate of growth of real wages across the world is really quite low, not just in the global south but also in the global north. The exception is China. And in China, the reason for the rise in real wages, to my mind, is not a tightness of the labor market, but because of government decree, that the government has actually raised the level of real wages. And this is why in China, the level of real wages is higher. Now, I think many, in some advanced countries, I'm like in France, for instance, the new Popular Front I was talking about the other day has decreed that the minimum wages should be raised. Now, if the minimum wages are raised, then that has a generally upward push effect as far as the wages are concerned. So, wherever the wages are not intervened upon by the government, you find there is a tendency towards stagnation. And China has been till now the only exception.
Any other questions?
So, when you are explaining the Branko-Milanovic effect,
no, but you see, the point is that the real question, you see, suppose you did not have this, suppose you did not have this, suppose you actually had something like this, then it wouldn't be a particularly difficult thing to explain, because that is basically what is happening. But the important thing is why you have the hump. And that hump, according to Branko Milanovic, is actually the Indian and Chinese middle classes who have been beneficiaries of.
It may be because while coming FDI, also technological transfer is also comes along with this FDI. So some population, they could adopt with that technology by human capital or other physical capital, then they could gain, right? That population. So maybe because of that.
No, I don't think it's. You just take, let's say, in Bangalore, that you have all these call centers and so on, where the real wages you're getting is something which is much higher than a corresponding wage such a person may have got in 1980. So, in a corresponding or comparable profession. So, the point is that the relocation of activities from the global north to the global south, of which countries like India and China have been beneficiaries, is something which has actually benefited, in particular, a certain segment of the workforce. Okay, and that segment is the one that explains the hump, according to Milanovic. I'm not kind of. Yes, please.
Sir, in the global south, every country has different political atmosphere and different economic condition. And also, you said that neoliberal capitalism suppresses the trade union. So, how can we prevent these crises?
Sorry,
how can we prevent this? You have complete your question.
How can we prevent these crises rises due to monopoly capital?
Neoliberal.
You mean how we overcome the crisis? Yes. I'll talk about it tomorrow.
Last question.
Please.
So you are suggesting that an impending recession is on the way.
What?
Recession. Because
already a recession. You see, the point is that recession has a very technical meaning. What recession means is 2 successive quarters in which there is a fall in output. But the point is that but if you are talking about ex-ante overproduction crisis, that would include stagnation as well. As a matter of fact, the fact that such a crisis is there is accepted by almost everybody, including very right-wing establishment economies. Lawrence Summers talks about, the prolonged stagnation of the US economy and so on. So, and he's a very right-wing, he's a establishment economist. So the point is that is not really in doubt. That is not really in doubt. It's not necessarily a recession or a 1930s kind of depression when you had 20% unemployment, 30% unemployment, but it's a crisis nonetheless. The unemployment is quite significant. And, for instance, in the European Union, when you calculate the real per capita income of EU, it has not increased in the last 15 years. So that's very important here.
Regarding the increase in the real wages in China, you said it's because of the policy of the state there to increase the real wages of workers. Now, China probably would have thought that their export-led strategy will not now work because of the stagnation in Western countries.
Absolutely.
Their exports started, feeling this problem. The rate of growth came down, and Western countries, particularly US, started hostile policies, anti-dumping, other interventions. So they were, in fact, preparing for this eventuality. And in fact, formally, Chinese government had announced that they are going to depend more on the home market and to build the local demand.
Yes. Yes, exactly. Absolutely true. Though really in China it is important also to boost the demand of the rural community, peasants and so on. The Chinese had got a policy which they adopted in one of the early party congresses, which was called Towards a Socialist Countryside, where the idea was actually to boost the real purchasing power of the peasants. What steps they have taken, to what extent it has happened, I'm not very sure. But on the other hand, what is also true is that, there is a certain amount of unemployment in China. It's very difficult to say how much, because they don't have nationwide surveys, but there is a certain amount of unemployment.
They might have given a rural bias. Otherwise, as you explained, if the urban income was growing, then the import propensity will be high.
Yes.
Because Chinese also import quite a lot,
yes.
particularly the well-off in China. So if they wanted to sort of build up domestic home market, then the rural bias should be there. Probably, in fact, I myself heard many Chinese policy makers saying that we are going to now focus on
rural demand,
domestic demand, home demand.
Yes, that of course. That they have been saying for some time, yes.
If there is no other questions, we will wind up now. So, thank you, Professor Patnaik. With the support of real-world examples, Professor effectively conveyed the issues associated with exchange rate determination, foreign exchange regime, international capital, and the issues of real